Welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jane Rachel Lippman. I staff the Jewish Roundtable of CLGS, the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second query series of this year, in which Rabbi J. Michaelson will talk to us about the election and what's next. Before we do that, though, we would like to dedicate this study session. In the Jewish tradition, we dedicate study sessions to the memory and the spirit of David Schneer, who was a gay Jewish pioneer who edited the groundbreaking book, Queer Jews, and lived a life of enormous courage and vision. Died last week at the age of died tragically at the age of 48, leaving his husband, Greg, co-parents, Karen and Dawn, as the bio mom of his son, Yanai, Kathy, and his daughter, Sasha. Very, heartbroken with his loss. I thought I would start by telling one story about David before we move to Jay. 25 years ago, I was the rabbi at Shar Zahav, the LGBTQ outreach congregation in San Francisco, and I hired David to be the education director. David was in his early mid-20s at that point, and for, I think it was Shavuos, the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish education for teens decided to have a big fair in which every synagogue or teen program would have a booth and present something. And David and I sat together at Shar Zahav laughing about this and deciding what could we possibly get away with, that where we could push the as far as we could possibly push it, but not get kicked out. And so we decided to have a cafe, sort of a beatnik cafe, in which our teens recited medieval gay love poetry, medieval Jewish gay love poetry. And we both loved this idea. I think David came up with it because it was textually based and therefore, intellectually sound. And we were really proud of our kids because their Hebrew was very good and, somewhat better than the average. And we felt like they could manage this both in Hebrew and English, and that in 1997, which was when this was really pushing the envelope to have these 14 and 15-year-olds reciting, "Oh my gazelle, how I love you! I love how your firm cheeks and how sweet you are." So, but we got away with it. And just we sat watching our kids do that, and we were just laughing and laughing. And I just remember what a fun, wonderful guy he was. And so in his memory, we're talking today. My David, I have to say, was my favorite, super smart, kind, thoughtful, revolutionary, Jewish gay man. But my second favorite is actually our speaker today, Jay Michaelson, who is equally intelligent, kind, funny, witty in addition to being intelligent, has wonderful values, and is always willing to say something revolutionary, which warms my heart. Jay is another pioneer in Jewish queer life. He started Neharim, which was the largest and I think most successful for many years Jewish queer organization. Why is Jay speaking to us today? Well, Jay has the distinction of being one of the very few queer theologians who's working as who's a working journalist covering the election. So he brings a great, both are at CLGS, both our perspectives to this important topic. Jay?
Thank you, Jane, and thanks everybody for joining. It's lovely to look out in rectangle land and see so many familiar faces in the rectangles, and thank you. And it is really moving to be, doing this session in David's memory. I too have so many nice memories of him. And it's funny, as soon as someone says his name, I actually picture him standing out over one of those beautiful kind of Colorado valleys with the mountains in the background at Limud, Colorado. And he was somebody who just created so many spaces. I remember he invited me to give a talk on campus at some point, and he was kind of helping with the Limud thing, and he had this and that, and throughout his entire life, including in his obituary, I found out things that he was doing that I hadn't known about, and it was just really inspiring to kind of intersect with Greg and David and their families' lives for professionally for as long as they did, and personally as well. So I'm bearing that in mind. And I know, looking around again at some of the faces here, so many of us knew David and have grown and benefited from his work. And as Jane said in the beginning, some of his work that he leaves behind is still essential reading for queer Jews and our allies and our friends. And so he's really left a mark that will remain. So sometimes when I kind of give talks like this, I like to say, make yourselves at home. So we don't really have to do that too much this time. What I thought I would do is kind of bring a little bit of this unusual kind of, hopefully, perspective that Jane mentioned a second ago, that I'm on the one hand, I love CLGS and have been doing work at this kind of intersection of queerness and Jewishness for a long time. And at the same time, I've just written, I think it's now up to 10 articles in the last week about the election and its aftermath. I focus at the Daily Beast, where I write, I focus on the courts and on the Supreme Court. And so with all of the sort of bogus lawsuits that are percolating up, I suddenly have a lot of work to do. My main job actually is working now as a meditation teacher, so I also have a lot of work to do there. And it is really striking how, I think we're all suffering, all of us who are sort of on left of center are suffering from all kinds of trauma and PTSD type reactions. First leading up to the election, worried that it would be 2016 again. Then, Tuesday night, even though I knew, again, working in this field, we all knew that absentee ballots were going to come in later. We all predicted exactly what was going to happen on Tuesday night, and yet I was still completely anxious, and people are really continuing to feel a lot of unease, some justified and some just our own psychological reactions to the continued stubbornness and uncertainty that is coming around on this election. So what I wanted to do was maybe hit 4 points a little bit and then have a lot of time for questions and answers and conversation, and kind of starting with a little bit about this moment that we're in just in the very short term, for the month of November. Talking a little bit about some of the Jewish and LGBTQ tensions that have come to light that are probably going to be still with us in the next couple of years. And then maybe some larger reflections, just a little bit on some of how this election has maybe disabused us of some comfortable delusions that many of us had. As I mentioned, from where I sit now as a rabbi meditation teacher, more than as a journalist, my number one feeling of concern and concern for queer Jews, for queer people, is more about pastoral care and the amount of suffering that's taking place right now. Primarily now, it's the size of the mental health crisis around the pandemic is slowly becoming clear. I don't think we'll know how large it really is until for some period of time. But queer folks, a lot of us don't have some of the forms of connection that a lot of other people do have. So we're particularly a little bit more vulnerable. And we're vulnerable to some of the effects of the mental health crisis that is to come over the next few months. As the weather gets colder, the pandemic gets worse. Again, something that was predicted all along, but now obviously it's happening in a horrifying way. And it literally keeps me awake at night, thinking about queer folks who are disproportionately non-partnered or disproportionately have difficult relationships with their families and are disproportionately in vulnerable populations, whether it's sex workers or whether it's trans youth of color. There are a number of parts of our community that are profoundly vulnerable to both physical and mental distress at this time. So, there was there have been moments of real hope. I actually missed the gigantic rally in Brooklyn for Black trans trans people right near my apartment, actually, in front of the Brooklyn Museum. But how astonishing was that to see, a large Black Lives Matter community, not queer identified, in solidarity with queer members of the Black community, and to see so many people who were queer identified or who were just allies who were there supporting trans women of color in particular, who, as I assume everyone on this call knows, have been suffering acute violence for some time now. And that hope remains. I still feel that there are some lasting changes that really give me a lot of hope. And yet again, in the short term, since that's this first of the 4 points is kind of this moment, November and December, I think we shouldn't underestimate the precarity that so many people in the queer community are living with right now. On the Jewish side, I feel like we've actually maybe come to value some of what we had taken for granted before the pandemic, some of the kinds of community that we're able to build, including obviously online, but that we're able to build interpersonally, the ways that we have of working with ritual and of working with the life cycle and of working with death and with loss, and the different ways that we have of connecting. One current effect of the fact that so many things are online are talks just like this one. Where just looking around, I have friends who are on this call calling in from Miami and from New York, obviously from the Bay Area, and from all over the country. And that's really unusual and really sweet and really beautiful. And so there's this moment of potential in both sort of our queer communities and our Jewish and queer communities that is really quite wonderful. But I still feel as though this moment calls for spiritual care. And I know CLGS has done a lot in terms of putting resources out and opportunities for connection out for queer folks, queer people of faith. I still feel as though those might not be, well, like as a community, as an overall community, we're not quite where we could be in seeing all of our community included in the ways that we have to connect that are so beautiful and that we've seen affirmed in the last several months. And I just wish we could have CLGS times 1,000. And ways to really have the tools and technologies that we have for building resilience, for building compassion and empathy and a concern for justice, to see those tools and capacities more widely spread. And we have to kind of get through this acute period right now. I think that's also true. This is my last part of the first of the 4 points. That's also true politically. Right now, regardless of our politics, probably we all should really be institutionalists. A lot of us grew up with like, fuck the system, but right now the system looks pretty good compared to the alternative. The system is under acute stress right now. And we may, as queer folks and as queer Jews, as kind of people who are at an intersection of two minorities, neither of whom are particularly well liked by a nativist and racist right wing, we might want to actually preserve some of the institutions of democracy that we have. There'll be plenty of time, I'm sure, when we turn to critique of this center-left administration that is going to take office in January, but maybe we're not at that critique point just yet. Maybe in January and for the 4 years after, we'll mostly be pushing that administration leftward in some way. But for me, at least, it's hard to get into that mindset right now. And I'm very aware that some of the institutions that are under attack, whether it's the free press, whether it's science, and whether it's the courts and sort of the apparatus of democracy, for all of their profound, deep flaws, they're also protecting us from, a mob that's many millions of people in size. And so there is a sense of, I think, acute crisis. We can talk more about this at the end. I didn't want to do too much of the kind of political piece, but if you follow me on Facebook, you know that I think the risk of a coup or a seizure of power is actually quite low, but the risk of violence on the part of the current president's supporters is quite high. And there have already been a lot of sort of plots exposed, targeting Black populations, so far not targeting queer or Jewish populations in a serious way, but that in order to kind of stimulate a response and to create something that looks like, if not a war, at least a period of unrest. Right on the eve of the election, probably folks on this call know there was a Jewish cemetery that was vandalized. And I do think, I'll get to this in a moment, but it is it is worrying to think about what it looks like when the anti-Semitic right no longer has a Judeophile ostensibly as its titular leader, and certainly that's something that is to come. So there's this moment, I think, of extreme precarity, and I feel really fortunate to be in the meditation business, where I have an opportunity to share some of the spiritual technologies that have helped me with lots and lots and lots and lots of people. And I'll put in a quick plug for 10% Happier where I work, that there's app access for free for anyone who's a teacher, which is, I feel like, half the people on this call, and also anyone who's working in the medical field or as an essential worker, however that's self-defined, and also for clergy. So if you're looking for ways to sort of bring in meditation into your own life, that's something that I'm personally working on. So moving then to the second of those 4 points, talking a little bit about some of the Jewish dynamics that we've just seen and how those are developing. It's clear the numbers are now in. Non-Orthodox Jews voted about 80% for Biden, 20% for Trump. Orthodox Jews voted roughly 80% for Trump and 20% for Biden. That's a pretty profound split. There's always been that split. The Orthodox Jewish community has always been actually politically to the right of non-Orthodox Jews, but that's still not to that extent, and that's quite remarkable. That split puts queers, and who tend to be more on the left side around some of these political issues, in a bit of a bind, right? We've seen that already now for 15, 20 years on Israel-Palestine. That may actually become more acute rather than less, as there's more attention that then gets placed on Israel-Palestine than we've had in the last couple of years. In a sense, things have been so bad that there's just been, it's kind of been overload, right? I mean, of course, for many of us who are involved in that activism, that still has been a central issue, but for many other folks, there's just been too much on the plate. Now, that may actually change in the next few years. And this kind of partisanization of the American-Israel relationship actually might end up being good for folks who are anti-Zionist, in that it's kind of shaking in the foundations of the American-Israel relationship. But for what used to be the center or the center-left, liberal Zionism, that's profoundly troubling. And that does look to become more of a struggle in the years to come. There is right now, demographically, still a very large American Jewish center on Israel-Palestine, kind of conservative and reform Jews who are liberal Zionist. That center is much larger than its parallel in Israel itself, where the center is much smaller, actually. And the Israeli Jewish population has moved quite far to the right, such that the opposition party, now nominally in the emergency government, the opposition party is also really a right-wing party and is not calling even for what we would see as a two-state solution. So it's not clear how long that lasts, but this is probably a tension that is going to change in dynamic from the way that it's been for the last 10 to 20 years, where there's such a radical split between Orthodox and non-Orthodox on American policy as well as Israel politics, but also within, let's say, the center left versus the harder left. That dynamic is really shifting, and it's not clear where the Democratic Party is going to go. The administration is pretty much the same as where the Obama administration was on Israel, but that's not true of the left half or so of the Democratic Party. So it's interesting to just kind of really, we see a lot of that, not on Israel-Palestine here where I am in New York, but on COVID-19. Until this past week, the hotspots in New York City were all Hasidic, except for one, were all Hasidic neighborhoods. These are all very heavily Trump voting neighborhoods. There are also communities that see themselves as insular and not necessarily part of the community of New York. They don't really care and have a fair amount of contempt for a lot of the kind of secular authorities, and secular includes Jews who aren't Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. And it was a really painful moment here a few weeks ago. Now the pandemic has spread to basically all of the more conservative neighborhoods. Staten Island is actually the highest rate of COVID spread right now in New York City. But for this period that just happened, a lot of us felt like we were really caught. It was hard to understand our relationship to this side of the Jewish community because it was so painful and so acute. And that is a shift that's taking place that we saw reflected in the election, but that's certainly going to continue. It doesn't look like it'll become more mild in the year or two to come. And it's something that it's just, you know, as we define who is the we, as I define myself, if I define myself as having a Jewish identity and what's that shared with, just as I define myself as having a queer identity and what's that shared with, the kind of overlap, what we have in common with people who are ostensibly in our identity group really seems to be shifting in a way that can be really painful to watch that happening. So that's kind of a Jewish piece. I want to talk a little bit about election and LGBTQ specifically, again, from a Jewish lens, but I would say that what we saw in the last couple of weeks has been a tremendous success of transphobia as a wedge issue for Republicans, including supposedly moderate Republicans. We saw this in the first year of the Trump administration in 2017, where there was kind of an attempt to split the T out of the LGBT or LGBTQ, where there was a massive attack that continued for the entire Trump administration on trans people, on trans existence, and less of an attack, although a little bit, but less certainly on LGB issues, or at least lesbian and gay issues. So whether it was marriage or non-discrimination or other issues, or there was some you know, some gay visibility within the administration, at least it wasn't horrible. Let's say there wasn't a rainbow White House, there weren't pride declarations, there were a number of offensive actions taken by the administration. They still pale in comparison to the war on trans people that this administration conducted, from the military ban to defining trans out of existence to anti-trans moves in education and in healthcare, to actually rebranding protection of trans populations as an offense against people's religious freedom. That the very idea of me as a physician treating a transgender person might be in some way a violation of my rights if I wanted to say no to them. That forcing me to uphold the Hippocratic Oath might be a violation of my religious freedom. I'll say more about that in just a moment. You know, this is getting much worse, and there were a number of Republican candidates for public office this election who ran on either on the bathroom panic or some other outrageous and false calumny about trans populations, and had a lot of success with that. I don't want to only dwell on the negative. There were a number of trans candidates who won local office in particular, and like I'm someone who sees the glass as half empty and the water is evaporating. So I've take everything I say with like a grain of sugar and make it a little bit better. But it is the case. So you know, we've had both, right? There've been some wonderful successes, particularly for trans folks in elected office. I still feel though that I've been pleasantly surprised as a pessimist that this attempt to sever the trans population from the rest of the LGBTQ community has not really succeeded, even with the sort of A-gays who we tend not to like so much. The mainstream organizations, whether it's HRC or anyone else, has totally refused to go along with this splitting of the community. And even the sort of privileged cisgender white guys, even the Republican ones, are not on board with some of the intense trans bashing that's taken place over the last few years. So that's great. But the success that scare tactics about trans people, and it's literally the same stuff, right, that we saw years and years ago, right? That it's, you know, these are boys and girls locker rooms, for God's sake. I mean, those myths are still being repeated, and they're being repeated somewhat effectively. That probably will just continue, right? That won't be federal government policy, but that could be state government policy in a number of red states. And more importantly, I think that'll be the cultural rhetoric from large swaths of the right. Ultimately, I'm sort of still optimistic about that because trans people do exist, and it's hard to like base an ideology on something that is that much of a sort of counterfactual statement. But then again, that's had a lot of success in the last few years as well. For the entire community as well, the second piece, second of the two pieces that I would highlight from a queer Jewish and queer religious perspective is the redefinition of religious freedom. So folks who know me know I wrote like a long report on this issue back in 2013, and back then I still had to sort of explain to people what this was, that there was this campaign to kind of rebrand discrimination as religious freedom, that I, as a discriminator, just like I gave in the trans example, that I am actually the victim by not being allowed to discriminate against a gay couple, that I'm the victim of the government abridging my religious freedom. This has now reached the highest level, at the Supreme Court and in the presidential elections. I remember there was one time, I think it was Paul Ryan mentioned it in the 2012, was he 2012 election? And it was kind of, I couldn't believe it had gained that level of prominence. It's now an article of faith. And it's something where we're not exactly winning this contested ground of what religion means and what religious freedom means. I'll say more about the religious left in a second, but in this one area, we're not actually taking that ground. So as some people probably know, over the day, literally like the day after the election, the Supreme Court heard a case about whether religiously affiliated adoption and foster care agencies can turn away same-sex couples from even the screening procedure. So it wasn't even placing children with them. It was even screening same-sex couples to say, yeah, these could be good parents, or these could not, these are not good parents. They refused to even take same-sex couple families into consideration. And they also said that for they would also not accept a single parent who identified as LGB or T or Q, I suppose, but they just said LGBT or T, LGB or T. The only question at the Supreme Court was how much they would rule in favor of that religious foster care agency. Justice Barrett has made numerous statements that she does share the right-wing redefinition of religious freedom. And what's really shifted in the last 15 years on this issue, but really even just the last 10 years, has been the notion that religious freedom is a different kind of freedom from everyone else, every other kind of freedom. So freedom generally means the ability to do pretty much, whatever I want, personal liberty, as long as it doesn't affect you. So I may have freedom to, fire off my guns everywhere, but not in your general direction. Or I may have freedom of speech, but to use the cliche, I can't shout fire in a crowded theater because that affects other people. Except in this one case, all of a sudden, the effects on other people seem to be secondary if they're mentioned at all. There was barely any discussion of the harm felt by couples who were turned away from that foster care agency, just like there was very little discussion of the harms faced by people who were turned away by the gay baker in Colorado. The notion that freedom now actually can impose harms on someone else is profoundly troubling. One reason that I'm concerned about the growth of this rhetoric is that as power shifts back to, let's call it the center left, the perceived oppression that many on the religious right express is only going to increase, right? I mean, this kind of doctrine, after all, really grew up during the Obama administration. And it's easy to kind of see the religious freedom argument causing the court, the Supreme Court and the lower courts, which, again, folks probably know, are now stacked full with Trump appointees, to kind of being the way they were before the 1960s, which is old conservative people stopping progress. Now, if you're my age, I'm 49 or a little bit older, that probably isn't the first thing you think of when you think of the Supreme Court. We've had this anomalous period from the mid 60s until the mid 20-teens, where the Supreme Court was actually leading progress and protecting rights of minorities and protecting the rights of the vulnerable. And so, at least for me, I grew up with that understanding that that's what the Supreme Court does, and lists whatever rights it was, from same-sex marriage to abortion rights to all of the rights that we kind of understand as being civil rights. The Supreme Court seemed to be playing a proactive role in guaranteeing those constitutional rights. But it wasn't always that way. Right? For the first century and a half of our existence, the Supreme Court was generally a conservative force, upholding slavery, upholding segregation, upholding the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Right? It was really only in the post-war period, starting really with Brown, that shifted. And that shifted, just for legal nerds, right? That shifted mainly because of FDR, who was the last president to propose court packing before our current or our next one. But not needing to enlarge the court because a couple of justices left the court, he actually stocked the courts with more liberal voices. But that was the first time that had really happened. All right, it was in the post-New Deal period. And so starting in the 50s and then 60s, 70s through to the present day, we've had this unusual period where the Supreme Court has been the protector of civil rights. And I don't think I'm being too pessimistic and gloom and doom to say that for queer folks, maybe not for Jewish folks, but for queer folks, that may change. That it may actually be seen as an entity that is preserving the rights of those who would do us harm. So I just say quickly, I don't want to get too happy to talk about this more in Q&A in a couple of minutes, but we did have that very positive decision from the Supreme Court that LGBT discrimination falls under existing anti-discrimination laws because it's akin to discriminating on the basis of sex. I cheered that ruling when it came down. It was wonderful to kind of see that. But again, these kinds of rights only have meaning if they can be enforced. And if anyone can proffer a religious excuse to discriminate against anyone else, what is that anti-discrimination right? So on the one hand, it's wonderful that the Supreme Court extended the reach of anti-discrimination law. On the other hand, if the exemptions to that anti-discrimination law are extended even further, then I'm not really clear that there's a net gain. You know, here I think, again, speaking at CLGS, this is an opportunity for religious progressives to really kind of take this threat more seriously, I think, than we have, and to make, I'll kind of get on my soapbox a little bit, to make theological, religious, spiritual, personal, and pastoral arguments, not just legal ones, right? We've had a kind of legal back and forth about what the Constitution means. But it's not the place for lawyers and judges to talk about, well, aren't you misreading the Bible or something like that? It is the place for theologians to kind of offer different readings of sacred text and of sacred community. So, you know, for example, isn't it true that Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, understanding that there is something that would later be called secular, or that would be called our responsibilities as citizens of a state. That is distinct from our personal obligations towards the Creator or toward God, if we understand theology in that way and with that language. There are plenty of other religious texts, after all, that we could be bringing forward, other than, I don't remember which chapter and verse it was that says you can't bake a wedding cake for a gay couple, but whatever one that one is. We could be actually making affirmative messages about don't oppress the stranger, because we were strangers and we know what it's like to be strangers in the land of Egypt. We understand or can understand or have the invitation to understand what it is to be marginalized and oppressed. And so maybe we have the capacity not to replicate that oppression. There are a number of ways in which people of faith or spiritual folks, spiritual progressives, can kind of attempt to take some of this landscape back from the arch conservative voices that have really kind of dominated it on this particular issue. What does religious freedom mean, and how does it relate to our treating other people? Finally, on this piece, there might be something positive here, and I think that comes from the racial justice uprisings, as well as some of what I've just mentioned about, that there's a moment with some opportunity for hope of reaffirming our solidarity with other oppressed groups. This is sort of one of those definitional questions that passing Jews and passing queer folks face. So as a white identified cisgender male Jew, I have an opportunity to pass in certain ways. I have a lot of educational privilege and class privilege as well. So that's great. I can get into the country club. I can persuade, I can use that privilege to advance my own success, and I can identify, if I want, with other privileged classes. So that's an option for me because of my ability to pass in these different ways. But that doesn't mean that's the only option. It's also, of course, possible for me to define myself in solidarity with other oppressed groups rather than with my fellow members of the country club. And it struck me many times how that question of identification is presented for American Jews and for American queer folks. Again, it does depend on a certain kind of passing privilege, but how that question presents itself maybe gets a little bit more focused. If it's true that after this current period is over, and let's say 6 months from now, there's actually a process on a sort of national level of soul searching and addressing systemic racism, that's an opportunity for Jews and for queer Jews to make what I would consider to be the ethical or the moral choice in that question of identification. Do I identify with my fellow members of the privileged class into which I have now been included? Or do I identify with what Christ would have said, the least of these. I think he was a rabbi, so I can quote him. And do I identify based on my own experience, just as the Torah says, if I can imagine what it was like to be a slave in Egypt, can I understand then what it is to be enslaved or subjugated or oppressed or marginalized in my own society? That's the biblical imperative, is to make that choice in a way that pursues and advances justice. And that, I think, might be an opportunity that we saw some of that during this past summer. And again, this isn't necessarily November, December, but when we can come up for air after a vaccine, after a transition of power, when there's an opportunity for some more space and breathing civic space, it might be that kind of opportunity for us to really seize that spiritual invitation, to take that invitation of identification seriously. And sometimes that gets labeled as, I think maybe not correctly, as intersectionality. For me, I understand it just as a mitzvah that, as mentioned, more than 10 times in the Torah, which is pretty remarkable, to not oppress the widow and the orphan, and those who are marginalized, those who are stigmatized, to not oppress the stranger, over and over and over again. So that's a little bit of the Jewish queer piece. And now I have one more point left, and then I look forward to comments and questions and so on. And it really is nice to see so many friends out there in the rectangle. So hi. Obviously, the ink is not dry on the election, and we're all in suspended animation, waiting for the kind of infant in chief to, as the I think was it the mayor of Philadelphia or the attorney general of Pennsylvania, to said, put on your big boy pants and grow up. That may or may not ever happen. But whether it happens or not, obviously there has to be an introspection on over 60 million Americans voting for Trump. There are many aspects to that, buying into the racism, buying into the lies. It might be helpful from a sort of, again, CLGS religious progressive point of view, to remember that a large majority of those voters identify as conservative religious, whether it's conservative evangelicals or conservative Catholics, primarily those two. And just understanding a little bit, this is obviously beyond a white dominated, it's arguably a white supremacist dominated part of the country. Kind of understanding that in our understanding of religious change, that this is a movement in large part that's a rearguard movement trying to fight back a change that ultimately they know they can't fight back. I think some of the profound cognitive dissonance that we've seen just in the last week is consonant with the cognitive dissonance that we've seen for the last several years. Election denial, COVID denial, science denial, climate denial, the denial of basic facts, the denial that Trump is obviously a con man, which seems obvious to many of us, but which is part of the worldview that he's not, as part of the essential worldview of so many millions of people. And ultimately the denial that America is changing, and that it's changing not because of some sinister George Soros conspiracy, and not because of some nefarious, cabal of pedophile cannibals, but it's changing because America is changing. America is becoming less white. It is becoming less conservative Christian. So it's not that these folks who are conspiracy theorists are necessarily wrong about the facts that they're responding to. Where they're profoundly wrong, is one, the moral valence of those facts, right? These are wonderful changes. Societies evolve and grow, and ours is changing. And then, of course, in their attribution of the reasons for those changes, that it must be some sort of conspiracy or thieves or whatever it actually is. Cognitive dissonance is on my mind this week because I have a article in the Daily Beast on it that's coming out this weekend. But just really thinking about that, we're thinking about the phenomenon that we're seeing in front of us now as one of cognitive dissonance and denial of reality. So for folks who aren't up on cognitive dissonance, right, this is the notion that human beings will do just about anything to resolve a contradiction between deeply held beliefs, including denying what the world actually is and denying what's actually true in the world. The term actually was coined by Leon Festinger, who was a psychologist studying failed messianic movements. He studied famously in the 1950s the UFO cult. whose leader promised that a UFO was going to come and deliver them to paradise. The UFO did not come, but rather than simply leave or feel disillusioned, many people who are casually identified with the sect did exactly that. But the true believers became more true believers. I first came across this work in my own work for my doctorate, which I wrote on a heretic and a failed messiah from the 18th century. There too, one would think that the failure of a messianic mission would just cause all the followers to leave, but that's not how the human mind works. When a concept, it's not even a concept anymore, but like when a core belief is so integrated into the psyche and into the conception of the self, it would be easier to just deny reality. So that whether it's that climate change is happening or that COVID is happening and that science were actually right and the dear leader was actually wrong, that the dear leader lost the election, it can be psychologically easier to deny these things than to admit them and let go of the sort of cherished belief. This kind of cognitive dissonance leading to conspiracy thinking and magical thinking feels like it just keeps getting worse. And I would say, I mean, it's not good for queers or for Jews when conspiracy and myth grow more powerful than reason and science and fact. It's profoundly disturbing. There is this kind of curious moment where, for all of Trump's many moral failings and I would say moral evils, he does have Jews in his inner circle, and he does have gay friends and a gay mentor, Roy Cohn. And so it's an unusual quirk where the person at the head of a right-wing populist nativist movement happens not to have as much animus, personal animus, against Jews and queer people as he does against many other groups. That's not going to last, right? Trump is a very unusual figure in that regard. Generally, the leaders of racist nationalist movements look like, I don't know, the other leaders of racist nationalist movements, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines or Bolsonaro in Brazil. They don't make exceptions for, you know, I hate some outside groups, out-groups, but not others. They just hate all out-groups. So it's not good for the Jews, it's not good for the queers, but it's certainly disturbing to think about what it means for the American polity. And I don't really see, here again, is sort of, I am going to end on an up note, by the way, but I don't really see what the tools are to dismantle that edifice of lies when there are so many on the other side who are willing to keep peddling them. Sure, it's fun to see that Fox News sold out Trump, and it's fun to see that the New York Post sold out Trump, but those aren't really victories. Those are just decisions made by you know, those organizations in their own self-interest. Long term, there's still this profound erosion of trust in our democratic system. Obviously, probably people know that 70% of Republicans say that they don't think the election was fair. About 35% say at least they believe that Trump is reelected and will remain president for the next 4 years. I don't know if they really believe that, but that's how they answer the polls. You know, these are very disturbing developments, not just for the fringe, but for you know, many tens of millions of Americans. I see there's a lot of really good stuff being written now on QAnon as a religion. If you're interested in kind of marginal religions, as I am, just nerding out on them, it's really interesting. I see that as continuous with the mainstream of support for the con man president, not discontinuous. I don't see it as different spiritual, psychological, or different religious studies phenomena. It feels like a slightly more extreme sect of the same religion. And so the kind of role here again for folks who find themselves at the intersections that I've been talking about, it's fascinating and also troubling to see some of the dynamics that we're familiar with in our study of religion playing out on such a massive scale. And it's definitely, it'd be foolish to try to predict where that's headed. But I did say I would end on a positive note before Q&A. I wanted to end at 1/4 of, and that's going to happen, almost. Which is to say that, look, you know, the worst was averted during the election. As I said, I'm less worried about a sort of coup-like seizure of power than I am about the erosion of truth and trust and the increase in conspiracy thinking. It can be hard to accept any good news right now, especially when the other side hasn't accepted it. But imagine where we would be had the election really gone the other way, and consider the kind of coalition that was built to make this change. Joe Biden won by the largest margin for a challenger since FDR in 1932. Right? There's a lot of sort of hand wringing about how close the election was, and it wasn't supposed to be this close. I mean, it was only close because we have a racist and white supremacist electoral college system, right? He's won by 5 million votes. Again, that's not just the most votes, which, you know, that gets said a lot, that he's got the most votes of any candidate, that's fine. But I think what, to me, it's the largest margin for any challenger of an incumbent, you know, in recent memory, you know, for almost 100 years. That's really quite remarkable. And there were so many different parts that came together for that. There were a lot of religious progressives. There were a lot of evangelicals who abandoned Trump, right? It was only a difference of 3 percentage points, but there's a lot of evangelicals in this country. So 3% drop in that population is millions of people. That's a lot of people that left. The role of women of color in a number of the swing states, totally amazing. The role of vote organizing and get out the vote campaigns. Also the votes of centrists, we might not want to include them in the same, you know, victory parade, but it is true that there were a number of, you know, white suburban women who went against Trump, went for him earlier. There were a lot of folks who crossed the aisle who were Republicans but voted for a Democrat president. Somehow I'd love to kind of have the breadth and expanse of that coalition in mind, and not let the negative story that, you know, I, as a neurotic New York Jew, focus on, not let that story be the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative, it doesn't feel yet comfortable to ease into it just yet because of this period. But if we take a bit wider perspective, this was a repudiation. And I want to suggest that maybe the last sentence or two that I want to say is that for those of us who are queers or allies or Jews or allies, we could take heart in that. And that after this period of precarity, after this period of profound suffering, and after this period of pandemic, it may be time for us to own our power. So I want to close there, and I guess Jane is gonna, you know, I don't know if people want to put in questions in the chat function if they haven't already, or if Jane, if you wanted to ask anything or make another point.
We have some questions in the chat, but before we do that, I want to sort of comment on your prophetic vision of CLGS taking on religious liberty. And Bernie's going to talk just a bit about our Liberating Religious Liberty program.
Thank you, Jane. Can you hear me? Let me share my screen here. For a while, about 5 years ago, because of the work of Justin Tanis and also Reverend Roland Stringfellow, we have had a Liberating Religious Liberty campaign. And so I'd invite you to go to our website for a number of resources. That also mentions the events that we have in connection with our Liberating Religious Liberty project. We do currently have a Bible study within Christian contexts, and recently we've been funded for our African American Roundtable, which interestingly is working on liberating religious liberty, in particular within Black Catholic communities, but beyond that as well. And then Jane is currently working on a religious liberty project from a Jewish perspective and with a Jewish lens. So check that out. And I do believe that the impetus for this religious liberty work that Justin launched was due to your Boswell lecture, Jay, several years ago. So thank you. And what goes around comes around, or however you say that.
Thank you. Yeah, I realized I did an unintentional bit of advertising for that, but
that's good.
That is what we need much more of. It's really, yeah. So I'm happy to give you the plug.
And we're just starting on the Jewish part of that, so we're glad for the plug. Several questions came up in the chat, and then I thought we would just turn it over to people who are with us. So the first one was the issue of the Supreme Court.
So yeah, I see this. So adding judges to the Supreme Court. So first of all, that depends on the Senate, and that depends on Georgia. So it's only plausible to even think about that if the Democrats control the Senate. That is now up to Georgia, so get busy, right? That's a hugely important election. There's a lot of good reasons to feel positively about that election, not least Stacey Abrams and the other sort of crusaders for democracy in Georgia, but also our base is more motivated. Turns out it's not such a great idea to tell your base that elections are all rigged and don't bother voting. So we have an advantage there. I'm in favor more of term limits. I actually wrote an article on the Daily Beast about that than adding justices to the court. But I think the best policy right now is actually the one that that Biden has announced, which is we're gonna have a long conversation about this, and bringing together a lot of folks, kind of trying to make it as participatory as possible. Ultimately, I feel confident that this will be a partisan battle. So despite that, I don't have any illusions that that's really going to bring a lot of new folks to the table. However, this is an idea that needs a little bit more thinking through. There's nothing magical about the number 9. It's not in the Constitution. And while it would really obviously be a dramatic step, it's also a dramatic step to appoint 3 justices, all of whom are under a cloud, right? Justice Gorsuch is in Judge Garland's seat, stolen from Judge Garland. Justice Kavanaugh has still never had a full accounting of very credible accusations against him and appears to have perjured himself during his confirmation hearing. And Justice Barrett should never have been put on the bench 2 weeks, or before the election over the dying wish of a beloved justice. So all 3 of the Trump justices have clouds over them. And that is also very unusual. So I'm certainly not against. I haven't been one of those voices pushing for quote unquote packing the court, but that's only because I've been busy writing other things. It's certainly something that I don't think it would do such violence to the Supreme Court that it shouldn't be considered.
So Jay, can you talk about why sort of the pluses of term limits? And Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, is in favor of them, has come out in favor of them, and also the reasons why term limits might be a problem.
So when the term limits appeal to a lot of different kinds of people, including originalists, people who look to the kind of original meaning of terms from the Constitution. When the Constitution was, when it was ratified, life expectancy was a lot shorter than it was. There was never an idea that justices would sit on the Supreme Court for 40 years. That's just preposterous. It also now, there's sort of such high stakes in these confirmation battles because they're so rare and they're unpredictable. If you had term limits, you could fix when they happen. So you would know when the next, they could phase in and you would know when the next confirmation battle would be. One of the proposals is to have 18-year terms. And so they come out in the middle years of every presidential administration. So it's never in an election year and it's predictable. And by having term limits also, it's not like life, so Justice Barrett could well be on the court for 40 years, right? Till 2060. Right? I mean, until my 3-year-old daughter might be a parent, or I mean, it's ludicrous, and it was not the framers' intention. It does lead to a conservative kind of tilt to the court because progress takes a long time to happen, but it increases the stakes of these nominations to just a preposterous level because they come along so infrequently. If there was always one, barring death, an untimely death of a justice, if there was always one per presidential administration, this could be regularized and it wouldn't be as heated as it is. Generally, the reason we don't like term limits is there's a worry that the justices might be, well, basically corrupt. If I have to go back either into government or private sector, that I might be making decisions in my own self-interest. I think that's a pretty weak argument, actually. They're already making decisions, not in self-interest, but they're already making their decisions ideologically. And there are also ways to do that. You can allow justices to go to senior status, still be drawing a salary, still be, and actually even restricted their other employment if they are in senior status. There are ways to account for that, and let's say barring ex-justices for running for public office, for example, so that they don't parlay their time in justice time at the Supreme Court. So there are ways to accommodate that concern, and it is a possibility that it could actually happen.
One question or comment was about the ideological nature, which you sort of Trump followers, which you dealt with in this issue of cognitive dissidence. But I'd like to ask about the marriage of ideology and corruption, and how that's working for the Republican Party, and whether you think that can continue to work.
That's working great. Yeah, certainly I think one of the more gratifying moments from Justice Barrett's confirmation hearings was where Senator Sheldon Whitehouse kind of pulled back the curtain a little bit and talked about the big money that was behind not just her nomination, but behind the senators sitting on the Judiciary Committee, behind the organizations bringing the cases that hurt queer rights all the time, and any number of other issues, and kind of revealing what was really going on. There again, if we just stay focused on the Supreme Court, we're headed fast in the wrong direction. So Citizens United, obviously allowing unlimited money in politics, a number of cases eviscerating the Voting Rights Act and allowing unlimited gerrymandering, and all kinds of, we're not just at a sort of steady state, we're moving fast in the wrong direction. And, again, I think there may be a space now in the next few years for folks who are in a more left political position to be more free to attack the entire system, because there's not the same thing at stake. We can attack everybody now, starting in January anyway, and there's a little bit more space to do that, where I think maybe a lot of us were kind of holding our breath for the last few months, and maybe now we can exhale.
Another question was about what I call the coalition of conscience, of what you're calling from sort of progressive, pretty far progressive, all the way out to center, about whether Biden is really center left or whether he's just center.
Yeah, I think we'll see. If you look, what's written on the page, on the platform, is definitely left, right? So whether it's $15 minimum wage or, pieces taken wholesale from Bernie Sanders's platform, it's by far the most left-wing presidential platform to be elected. Of course, that's what's written on a page. It's easy to imagine, certainly if there's a Republican Senate, none of those things are going to happen. It's also easy to imagine, Joe Biden, I think one of the strengths, one of the positive attributes that he does bring to this office is a long history of being able to compromise, but that's not going to please the left, right? A lot of compromises with folks in the center and the right. It's too early to tell, which Joe Biden it'll be, and also even which Kamala Harris it'll be. She also has a kind of a mixed record. I think she's got a more progressive record than some of her critics gave her credit for during the primary, but still not entirely. A lot of that will depend on what kind of pressure they're under, and what's going to be shaping their own political dynamics. So it's going to depend on us. If there are issues we need to move them to the left on. I do think that there's also this period of undoing the Trump nightmare, which maybe is the first quarter of 2021. And you could just follow along in the newspapers. Everybody knows what has to be overturned and what has to be done very quickly, and how much can be done just on an executive level. So maybe we get through that, and then we come up for air again. And then but it's going to depend on the left pressuring the administration to take more progressive positions. Absolutely.
I'm interested in your view on the fundraising that went on, and that listening to Lindsey Graham, complain and whine about the fact that Act Blue was raising millions and millions and millions of dollars from small donors was quite the surprise. So do you have any comments on that?
You were surprised? I wasn't surprised. Anything that it takes to, I wasn't surprised at all.
No, I mean, I wasn't surprised at Lindsey Graham whining. But yeah. I have to admit, I was surprised at Jamie Harrison's bank. That did surprise me.
Well, more than, there are two men who were responsible more than anyone else for Justice Barrett getting on the court, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, and they both had really appealing challengers who a lot of us gave a lot of money to and really wanted to win. Lindsey Graham knew full well that I mean, the guy went on tape saying, hold this against me. So that's exactly what we did. We held it against him. He's a hypocrite in a lot of ways. And Hamevin Yavin on that, but you know, he clearly is somebody who doesn't tell the truth about anything. And so it wasn't surprising. It is true that there was a lot of outside money in that campaign, you know, and that's going to be one where somebody mentioned, I think Rick just put in the comments, you know, one of the challenges the Democratic Party is going to have now is balancing the diversity within the ideological diversity within the party. So for, you know, Jamie Harrison may have been one of those candidates who was actually hurt by slogans like defund the police or words like socialism and so forth. But we don't really know. And there were other candidates who were helped by taking more progressive positions. So it's clearly, you know, it's one thing, it's a very, you know, to be a senator in South Carolina, that's a pretty heavy lift. And you might, it's just not possible to have a progressive vision on a national level that also works for South Carolina politics. We'll see it as the postmortems get a little bit more detailed if that was really true, if the left-wing rhetoric really hurt him. The Republicans would have used anything against him. And even if people weren't really calling for defunding the police, they would have said that people were. So it may not really matter what the left does because the right's just going to say what they're going to say. But yeah, I'm only a little surprised that you're surprised. I mean, it's not, you know, painting outside voters as swinging an election. I mean, that worked well for everybody, all of the Republicans who won. Whether
No. Well, I'm surprised at our side's fundraising ability.
Oh, that we did it. Oh,
yeah.
Man, we hate Lindsey Graham. No,
I know, no, not Lindsey Graham, but I mean all around that we can raise as much money, you know, because the reason they've taken away all these campaign financing laws was so that they could pour money and buy elections. And I'm wondering if you think, you know, thousands upon thousands of small donations is going to really make a difference and that they won't be able to buy elections anymore.
Well, the best support of what you just said is Bloomberg, right? I mean, here was somebody who tried to buy election and ended up only with American Samoa, right? And the key states that he invested in for the presidential election, you know, Texas and Florida, he didn't flip, right? So so be careful how loud you say that, though, because it's on the one hand, we want to encourage progressives to see the power of that. We saw that in Bernie Sanders' campaign, obviously, right? That the power of small donors to combat bigger money. On the other hand, if we say it too loudly, then we can all say, oh, see, so don't worry about Citizens United. Let the Koch brothers buy our elections. Let the, you know, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. I do think that if you look at, let's take what Senator Whitehouse exposed in the Barrett nomination, you know, there's something like 70 or 80 million dollars of dark money that we have no idea where it came from. That was behind her and Kavanaugh and also Gorsuch and also anti-Garland, right? This organization called the Judicial Crisis Network, which is the Federalist Society funneling these candidates through. We don't even know who's giving that money. So yeah, on the one hand, it's great. You know, small money, small donors have made a huge difference. And everyone on this call, I guess I'm not allowed to say, like, you know, go on Act Blue right now for the Georgia Senate race. But if I were allowed to say that, that's what I would say. But having said that, the problem of dark money does go deeper even than just elections. And we'll see that. And we're going to see it again for folks who are to the left, on the left side. We're going to see it in the Biden administration. You know, big finance tends to support Democrats. They like centrist Democrats. Centrist Democrats are usually the best for the economy from the elite perspective. They're good for the stock market. They don't run up the debt like Republicans do. So big finance, Wall Street likes centrist Democrats. We'll see what fiscal policy looks like in a Biden administration, whether it looks, you know, like Elizabeth Warren or whether it looks like Goldman Sachs.
Yep. So we're done with the questions that were in the chat. Does anybody here, as you call it in the rectangle, have a question or a comment or something they'd like to say? Before we end, I also want to make a pitch. I know that we're still exhausted and completely burnt out, but 2022 is a good Senate schedule for people on the left. you should take a look at it before if we don't hit, I would be thrilled if we get Georgia, but if we don't get Georgia, don't say Kaddish, okay? And instead, I'd urge you to go look at who's up in 2022 and see that we have a very good chance, an excellent chance of taking the Senate back then if we don't get it now. So all is not lost. I agree with Jay. We could all bench Gomel, which is the Jewish prayer for averting disaster. We have averted, I believe we have averted disaster. And I'm hopeful for that. I might eat my words in 2 weeks, but I am hopeful that that is true. And
I've been willing to go out there and I'd rather be wrong. I'd rather have to eat my words in 2 weeks because it is true. Actually, maybe that segues to some, Shira just put in, what meditation's helping me ground right now. We could kind of end with that actually, if you wanted. Maybe we don't have to do the meditating, although we could. For me, it's been recognizing just to answer kind of that question, recognizing the presence of, let's say, cortisol in the body, the stress hormone, fight or flight, just checking in over and over and over again. And one word that's helped a lot, since that way we don't have to, there has just been the word "and." I wrote, I'll actually put it in the chat now if people want to read that. I just did I'm typing now. Just did a little written Dharma talk on the word "and," that these things are happening, and it's possible to just be present in the body, feeling the weight of the body on the chair, feeling a single breath, kind of what Tibetans call small moments many times. And part of what I like about that way of meditating, rather than trying to calm down, first of all, I hate trying to calm down, but I also feel like it does, I don't want to devalue even implicitly any feelings of tension, anxiety, fear, because those are justified. And it's not as though there's even, if I get too calm, there could be a sense of like, it's not justified to also feel different ways. And, we're heading into a really scary period in the pandemic, all across the country. And the numbers are horrifying. And if you just take even a moment to just contemplate the amount of suffering that's taking place, or so there's that sadness I can feel really richly, and then I can feel a lot of anger toward how much of this could have been averted, right? And why it wasn't, and the actions of some people that cause us to be, right? So the pandemic was going to happen, and we would have suffered, and we did suffer, but this current wave, could really have been so much less than it is, just with some sound respect for science and people doing the right thing and considering other people and respecting them, so that I can feel that anger, get pretty intense. And I don't necessarily want to even not feel those. So for me, that word "and" has been very helpful, vav in Hebrew, that there's that, and there's this moment, here's this breath, there's a moment of spaciousness around it. And then I can go back to worrying. I don't have to feel good for more than 2 seconds, because a minute later I can just do another "and." And that's what's so just responsive. That kind of practice has been what's grounded me a lot. And since Bernie made the plug for CLGS, I could say that 10% Happier on our website has a number of free guided meditations. That was just a cat knocking the table here. There we have a number of free meditations and other resources that can help during this period, specifically focused on this period of acute anxiety that so many of us are feeling.
Do you want to give us a short meditation to close?
That was it.
No, that was, I thought you were going to have us vav a bit.
No, you don't have to sit comfortably. You don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to do any of that. It's just that word "and," that there's what's happening, and there's this moment, and there's this moment. And yeah, bye, Eric, who's just leaving now.
So I want to say that something that has really helped me is Mel Brooks, hope for the best, expect the worst. And that is my favorite meditation right now. And I that into the chat box, so that I hope you'll enjoy Jewish humor in difficult times. Thank you very much, Jay. Oh, this was great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Okay,
That was great.
it was great. I thought that was
Yeah, really good.
really
I didn't
good.
I didn't get a chance to promote December 3rd, but
That's okay. It went by once at least.
Yeah.
I'm shocked to see like that Julia already got it up on. Amazing, right?
yeah, she's incredible. And I don't think I will try tomorrow to put a $25 ad. I don't think that will be refused, because the one that we have on harm reduction went through with no problem at all. So maybe they did accept it, and I think it was the word election.
Sounds good. You know, it was fine.
It was great, and it's
right.
recorded.
We don't measure by who isn't here.
Yeah.
We measure by who is. Right.
Exactly.
Good work.